Hey, Matt, what's going on? Good to see you again.
Good to
How's
see
your
you,
week
brother.
been?
Oh, yeah, I'm excited because my sister and her kids are flying in from Connecticut and picking up at the airport later today. And we're going to do some exploring, go check out Lake Tahoe. Her kids have not been here since they were wee little ones. So I'm sure they don't really remember much. And yeah, we're going to have a good time this weekend. It's hot August nights here, so we're also going to be out checking out all the different, old school cars, and that's always a ton of fun. And the first time my sister and kids will be able to do that too. So lots to look forward to. And my anniversary on Saturday.
Oh, congratulations.
Yes. 12 years we're going on. I know we've got many more to come, but we've knocked out our first 12, and it's been a really wonderful ride. So that's what's going on with me. What about you, brother?
Well, you're an incredibly high integrity human being, Matt. So I won't make a joke about anybody who can stick it out with you for 12 years. Has got to be pretty special because you're both pretty special people.
I'm pretty sure you just did, but that's all right. That's all right.
No, I did absolutely. You two are made for each other, and it's fantastic to see you guys together.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I concur, and I do realize I'm a lot to handle. My wife calls me on my crap, and that's what I've always really liked about her, because before that, I kind of just did what I wanted when I wanted, right? So she calls me on things, and at the same time, tough but fair. And I think we've got a good symbiotic relationship there. But yeah, no, very lucky. And yeah, just living the good life, and many more to come. So thank you.
Oh, no, you're so welcome, man. Welcome to the Run Form Podcast. I'm Bobby McGee, running mechanics expert.
And I'm Matt Pendola, your run-specific strength coach.
Matt and I have been working together for almost a decade on some of the top athletes in the world, and we've decided to share that process with you guys. So pretty exciting this week. We are going to be talking about vertical oscillation, which has been around as a concept in running mechanics for a very long time. But it's not necessarily well understood because, again, its application is kind of, I wouldn't say its application is misunderstood, its application is not understood, right? And so what can you learn from vertical oscillation? So basically, to just explain to people before we start a conversation with that and how it applies to our world of drills and mobility and stuff like that, is that vertical oscillation is the amount of change you make per stride in your height above the ground. And it's normally measured from your head. So how much did your head go up and down? So in the old days, I remember us always, as coaches, standing trackside on the main side of the grandstand and then picking a point on the bleachers, because the bleachers have a lot of lines that are running parallel to the track surface, and watching the runners. And we were always commenting that the very, very effective runners were vertically oscillating very little. They were really, really smooth. And it really is a good indication of what's going on in your stride. But now we know it's really interesting to look at intra-run changes at the same velocity that give us a clue as to how can we help the athlete become more efficient. And by that I mean is vertical oscillation is associated with velocity, right? So the faster an individual runs, the more they will vertically oscillate, right? So if somebody says, like, I'm running 10-minute pace and I'm, vertically oscillating X if I'm using my stride device or some way of measuring my vertical oscillation. And then when I pick up the pace, it gets higher. Does that mean I've got inefficient? No, it doesn't mean that you've got inefficient. But intra-run, on the same kind of surface, at the same velocity, if that vertical oscillation starts to get higher, it's a clue for us. It's what fatigue is doing to you. And mostly what the fatigue is doing to you in that case with vertical oscillation, it's shortening your stride length. And when your stride length shortens, your launch angle becomes steeper. And so you start going higher in an effort to maintain your pace, right? Because we're all in this distance running game because of pace, right? Everything comes down to pace. It doesn't really matter what your stride length is or what your stride rate is, as long as you're hitting the pace for the duration that you're looking for. And that's the game that biomechanically we always play, and that's where vertical oscillation becomes so important. So, to throw the ball over into your court, Matt, what are you noticing with split stance type things that indicates people's proficiency to be able to sustain a certain stride length, in other words, able to sustain their vertical oscillation over a given period of time?
Yeah. Just toes to the nose, right? Simple as that. And if vertical oscillation is too much there, just chop your head off and you're good. No, it's a really complex issue that I know I tended to struggle with you talking about, hey, Bobby, how can we start to look at this from the very beginning in our assessment process, right? So the key thing I think I want people to understand is that your posture is your brakes, right? And when we say hold your posture, let it flow out of you, that is now allowing you to minimize that vertical oscillation. So when we get you into balance drills, that's the first indication to me in a split stance, right? So don't skip the balance work. But I was thinking about this a lot for this podcast and saying that I used to tell clients, whenever you're brushing your teeth, just brush your teeth with a single leg. And hopefully you brush your teeth for 2 minutes. So balance on one leg, brush your teeth for a minute, and then switch legs, right? And the other minute. And if you're doing that twice a day, you're constantly getting in good balance work, right? Now I tend to say, hey, get into that split stance, but as wide as you need to be where you can keep your forward hip a little bit more up and through. Now I'm going to take it one more where we're going to make brushing our teeth even more effective, right? So if we are leading with our right shoulder, our left hip should be forward, and you should be able to maintain a good stance. So again, start a little bit wider. Now you're going to lead with that right shoulder as you brush your teeth, okay? Right? And then after the minute, switch arms. So now you've got to get a little bit better at brushing your teeth with your non-dominant side, which is a good thing as well. And then what I look at from there is starting to narrow our stance. And then once we're really good about getting our overall posture, again, we're going to remind people that we're talking about being compact in a good compact position where our arrowhead, our sternum is slightly down, that we are now able to connect through, in this case, our peripherals being our lead shoulder and our opposite hip. And then, of course, that improves the cadence. So as we get better at that, then we finally switch to a single leg balance. And the reason why I've come to understand that we don't just go into single leg balance is because I would see that people would be spilling their spine, their hip would be bailing out laterally or to the side oftentimes. And then you could kind of see that floating leg kind of cocked in order to get that balance or steer that balance a little bit more like a rudder. And so now they're out of position and they're actually myelinizing or memorizing a bad position, right? So those are the steps that I like to start with. And what's cool about that is that you can start that on day one, even without me or yourself, looking at your form. It's a pretty simple process to manage.
Oh, fantastic, Matt. Just a warning to parents of younger runners. Introducing the toothbrush concept to them might lead to them not brushing their teeth. So it's too complicated, right?
Sure.
So I think, one of the things that Matt refers to is that if you are balanced and your foot's on the ground and your pelvis is balanced, right, then you have a certain dynamic height relative to the ground. But as soon as you are, internally rotating or you stepping, you crossing that center line that you're running on, that imaginary center line, then that's making you shorter, right? So one of the first things that I learned this from two biomechanists from the Australian Institute of Sport, is this concept that elite runners flex their knee on the ground less than what, say, an average or an amateur runner. So they are putting their foot down on the ground. So they are beating gravity to the ground with their foot. So they're not dropping their pelvis as much mid-stance. They are dropping their pelvis mid-stance, but not as much, right? So they're not pivoting their pelvis as much, and they're not dropping their pelvis as much. So when you drive down, you're sustaining a certain level of height. So a good number that I like to look at when people are running is that there's not more than 50 degrees of flexion from the time they first contact the ground until they are into mid-stance, right? So that degree of flexion is required. It's a shock absorption. It's a loading process, all right? And you don't often get people that understride, right? Ironically, we are working with an individual who started off with us as an understrider, right? But pushing that foot down. So I like to distinguish between two parts of vertical oscillation. How much are you vertically oscillating while you are on the ground? All right. And then your overall vertical oscillation, which includes that takeoff where you obviously have to overcome gravity. So you need a significant vertical component to overcome gravity. But that whole reasoning that we use for anything that we use to get the feet down, right, to stiffen the leg downwards, a part of that is to reduce vertical oscillation when we are on the ground. So we want to get the foot down on the ground, obviously closest to our center of mass as possible, all right, loaded as much as possible, but we also want to have that knee as straight as possible. It's definitely not extended, right? It's flexed. It's serving as a loading spring, but we don't want it massively flexing. And very often when people lose that hip angle because they are not powerful enough to drive that foot down quickly enough, all right, the knee has to make up for that. But the thing that we have to look at with the knee is it can be flexing outwards functionally as well. And we don't want that. We want it just to be flexing in a vertical plane, right? In that vertical plane, and then trying to hold it stiff. We don't want it flexing from the time we hit the ground too much by the time we get into mid-stance. Once we're in mid-stance, now the knee starts extending, right? Our center of mass is passed over our pivot point, and we now are pushing against the ground, but now that pushing is starting to provide propulsion and then unloading. But if we don't push against the ground and the knee stays flexed, then all the elastic loading in the plantar fascia and in the Achilles tendon, back of the knee and the hip and so on, that is all basically lost. And we now have to revert to muscular contraction to power us off the ground, right? And that's not an ideal situation to get into. So vertical oscillation is more an illustration of what you're not doing correctly, right? It's more that than I'm doing these drills to work on my vertical oscillation. You know, with vertical oscillation, you're trying to minimize, but you're realizing that you need a vertical oscillation as an expression of how you're moving. So if you're looking at a runner and you're watching their head in a forward plane, right? So what you're seeing is it going up and down, but also how much is it moving? You know, that's also the key, right? So that's why they call it oscillation. So it's like a graph, you know, how much is it going up and down, and how can you optimize that for that individual?
Yeah, and with the drills that we have, the fourth week into our series that we do with Run Form, we have established now much better overall balance, and we've worked on a lot of that musculature, okay? And so, again, getting those postural muscles first and foremost. And then in week 5, we start with your blade drill there, right? And it is actually the very first movement that's assigned in Run Form, which is in the 5th week. And it just starts with this beautiful component about realizing that runner that we were talking about, or you were mentioning earlier, that with his right side, he was always scooping or blading in a little bit past his midline on that right side. And as he gets more and more fatigued, that arm gets a little bit more of that, we'll say that disassociation, right? Which is not leading to the cadence that he wants. So I went on a 10-mile run with him yesterday, and we started off with just loading his springs a little bit. So some pogos and some switches. And then as we're running, I noticed that posture starts to get a little bit more wonky as the miles are going on. So what I suggested to him is we're going to start with those blade hands. And he is in his 5th week, so makes sense, right? And we are starting with the blade hands, but just more in that balance. And all I want him to do is comb his hair, through that top position, right? So if you see what I'm doing there, if you're watching the video, he's looking at that function there and really just memorizing that function. I said, microset that one in throughout your day. For the next several days, that's what he's primarily working on. And again, that position, you start with your feet in a split stance, but they are wider to begin with, so that you are working more on that adaptation, especially through how your shoulder is leading and his right shoulder leading in that movement, right? And that is what I'm really wanting to get down now. But knowing him and the process that he's gone through, he's been very, very religious, if you will, about doing his work and his protocol. And so I think this will adapt very quickly now that he has the posture for that. Because the last thing I kind of want to mention here, and then I love your feedback on this, Bobby, but just, a lot of times when we are talking about fatigue, where we run into a problem is where we start to have that failure is because our engine a lot of times is exceeding what our posture can do, right? And so
absolutely,
yeah. And so take that concept, guys, and realize that where, again, with Bobby, he had assigned Ryan 9 ones yesterday, 9 minutes of running, 1 minute of walking. And that is why also with that fractionalized approach, we can reset the posture. And now Ryan can work on some blade hands a little bit more when he has even his 1 minute of walking as well, right? So those are all things that we can build on.
Yeah, it's so ironic, that little article in the Wall Street Journal that they consulted with me on how effective is Tom Cruise as a runner, and that's one of the things that he does really well. He's got those beautiful bladed hands, and they are beautifully on plane as well, so just indicating how critically important that is. And so here we are in a conversation about vertical oscillation, and exactly my point is that vertical oscillation is impacted by everything, right? So the planes that your hands are in, all those things are become so important, right? So just looking at what's happening, that's why it's so useful to have video of yourself every now and again doing exactly the same workout for the same duration at the same speed on the treadmill, and looking at what's happening intra-run to your vertical oscillation, to your arm action, right? So everybody has this awareness in the beginning that this is how I want my arms to go, right? And just as an aside there with arms, when people start working on their arms, they tend to emphasize the forward swing because that's what they can see. And the forward swing is actually the reset, all right? And they should be emphasizing the backward swing. I like to use the term down and away. That's what you're trying to do with your arms, down and away, as opposed to setting them up in the front here, right? So that's just the preset or the reaction to the powerful elbow swing backwards. But that plays a huge role. So I think what you were saying really alludes to a principle that we use all the time, right? What are people doing in the beginning of a workout? What are they doing in the beginning of a race? And what are they doing mid-race? And what are they doing late race? And what can we learn from that? All right. How can we give them cues to increase their awareness? Because if they're able to do that in the beginning of the race, not thinking about it, automatically in the right place, and then they stop doing it and they get off plane and they start to vertically oscillate more at the same velocity, well, then we know it's a conditioning thing, but it's also a focus thing, right? So we've known from a sports psychology perspective that cueing in endurance events must become more frequent, right? If you only need to cue every 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning of your long race, right? You might need to be cueing as much as every 30 seconds or every 100 steps or something like that by the time you get to the end of the race, because fatigue plays games with your mind, right? And I love that analogy. If you want to go and run 8-minute pace, know that 8-minute pace in the first third of the race is going to feel really slow. Middle of the race, 8-minute pace is going to feel challenging but manageable, and end of the race, 8-minute pace is going to feel like 7 or 6-minute pace, right? To just maintain 8 minutes. So it just that indication that your level of focus must go up. And so in these very long races, a good piece of advice is don't have a lot of noise going on. Trust your training, trust your skills learning, trust your conditioning, all right? Because you mess with your automatic programming if you think about your form in the early mid stages of a race. If you are moving beautifully, you will use less oxygen if you're not thinking about it. You're using those mood words and those feeling words. And then when things start to fall apart, it helps your focus to pull up your cues and say, where am I looking? Where's my head position? I feel like I'm stomping the ground. Am I vertically oscillating, et cetera, et cetera. And just as another little addition there, some people oscillate insufficiently, which means they're bending their knees too much and they're kind of scuttling along and they're putting a lot of pressure on their quads, right? You need to extend those quads for them to reset and to go again. You really don't want a very long-term high flex knee in that low kind of shuffle that you have as well, right? I mean, even the great shufflers in the world, people that can run, under 2.5 hours for the marathon with this really, really high cadence, they still in range. They're not adding load because of that. But, you get people that are understriding, flexing their knees too much and getting tremendously fatigued.
Yeah, and a couple of things that, as you're talking, I'd be interested. We haven't actually previously discussed this, but I have 2 athletes right now. One, Ryan, that we've already mentioned, and he has, with his arm swing, it's actually almost too compact to me. Whereas when we mentioned before, Tom Cruise, and congratulations on the article, you're kind of a big deal, buddy. Maybe Tom will call you up and that's an action movie and you got to save the day and, you're sprinting all out. And so you see that big range there, right? But of course we are talking about endurance and we have a more compact position in that range, right? But of course we want to be able to train the full range. That's why in the drills, we set it with that full range and then we forget it. And we can go on to that fractionalized approach that we've been discussing here. Now, the other end of it, though, with another athlete I'm working with, and I'll certainly be talking about this a lot more in the future. Special surprise guest will be coming on, and you all know her, but she has been working a lot on more of her front end mechanics. Okay, she was a former 1,500 meter runner, and really those back end mechanics were getting her into a little bit of trouble now that she's doing a full distance Ironman. Okay, and when you come into that, you're looking at with the arm position that we're almost now needing to reduce that arm swing a little bit more. And again, that's so neurally rich through your shoulder girdle and close to your brain that I just find, yes, we did have a particular issue we were working on down the chain, okay? And after we've been working, now it's been about coming up on 4 weeks, so coming up on a month this Friday, but there is 0 issues, 0 pain with that area now. And so don't get me wrong, she worked on it every day, AM and PM. We really got after it. But I would say the last 10 days has been, magical running, right? And yesterday was the big breakthrough day. And you can see the difference when I looked at her running form on the track as opposed to what it was like just a month ago. So, those are some things that I think it's important to talk about in the sense where some of us, I think most of us, we need to look a little bit closer at how we are pushing, okay, versus being a puller, right? And so hopefully that gives you some concepts, some ideas about what we're really going for here, but how important that arm swing really is for your cadence when it comes to distance. We really do see that we are going to be able to hold that pace and make it feel more like that 8-minute pace towards the end, the more we've been able to increase those capacities.
Oh, no, brilliant, Matt. I think a good example there is to show how, what you've done previously. A lot of these shorter distance athletes don't have a concept, especially if they have a big anaerobic reserve and they come from that high octane kind of background, right? So when they go to distance running, they tend to have these long energy absorbing, energy requiring strides, right? They don't have that gait that we always talk about, right? That border collie gait that you have that's not natural to everybody, right? You have, the African runners, they've spent so much time running as a means to an end, right? They're trying to get to school, or they're trying to get to work, or running is their mode of transport. So they've developed this way to not get sweaty, to not get sore, all right? And they haven't come from a background of, say, football or basketball or something where sprinting is their stock in trade, right? And they have that gait, right? Everybody can walk, everybody can canter, but not everybody can trot, right? Trot, you need to teach a horse to trot and stuff like that. So I think what becomes important there is to look at your background, your understanding of what effective distance running is, all right? And then very importantly, when it comes to things like vertical oscillation, look at your anthropometry, right? So we are privileged to have worked with two individuals that have very different anthropometry, right? The one is Gwen. He has very long legs, a shorter torso, all right, and has a lower cadence, all right, and an extremely long stride length. But all of that is still within range, right? So if you watch Gwen's arm action, it's very closed elbow angle at the back, right? Very high elbow. Whereas Ben got more of that swimmer's body, almost triathlon body, right? He can afford to carry his arms a little lower down because his cadence is higher. So if you look at Gwen mid-stance, her heel is really close to her butt when she's going at speed, right? Whereas Ben is sort of more like 45 degrees from his butt to that minimum requirement of shin parallel, right? So you really don't want to model your run on somebody else's run, right? Your run is unique to you, but unique to you pre any kind of injuries, pre any kind of sedentary activity, right? And so that's always what we're trying to return to, okay? And then there's also just a speed capacity that you can handle. And I think that's a very important thing to work on, right? And so much of training today is about designing this perfect engine, filling up all these physiological containers to their maximum capacity, all right? We need to have that same kind of mindset. Working with a junior coach now down in Texas, and we're talking about what do we do with these athletes now that, this coming weekend is nationals for the juniors, right? The national U.S. championships. What do we do with them from now till the end of the next season, right? The swim coaches are not going to be seeing them. The running coaches are not going to be seeing them. They're not going to be anyway, but in that triathlon kind of mode. And how do you work with skills, right? And that's so important too, that you now start, what is your personality type, right? Or have you been around for so long that you don't want to mess with your gait. It's brought you to a certain point, right? And that's why I think it was so important. You were speaking about utilizing activities that in the athlete's mind accidentally lead to what you're looking for, but in our mind are done with intent very, very early on in the process, right? So that's where that last part that I want to say is where buy-in comes in. Like, this is a silly thing for me to do. It's hard for me to do. I feel clumsy. I feel awkward. This is kind of getting to my ego a little bit because it's embarrassing that I can't do it. It's like triple springs, right? It's such a simple movement from a physiological demand place, but from a skills development place, it's a really difficult movement to do, right? And once athletes do it, they love it so much because it's such a natural movement, but they'd never done it. And so they struggle in the beginning. And a lot of people quit on triple springs because they just feel like they can't master it. They try too much with that part of their brain instead of just relaxing into it, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at both of us, right, when we're doing triple springs, which is a huge part of vertical oscillation, right, of coordinating knee flexion, hip flexion, ankle flexion, arch flexion, right, is that we are so often putting stuff in the way, right? If somebody can't do triple springs, the first thing I do is I put a strap around their knee, make them flex their knee, and then just pull the strap away. The second thing I do is I'll throw a harness around their waistline. Anything for them to move their attention to a flowing movement as opposed to trying to do a movement.
Yeah, and I want to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about banded dynamics in our programming, because people do get into the programming thinking that they're going to, in that pillar, look at lifting, weights, right? And we chose banded dynamics for a couple reasons. But I want to be very clear. First, yes, it's convenient. You can take your bands anywhere, and especially when you have the setup that we have with our gym in a bag, we have an anchor so you don't ruin the bands. And Ben, if you noticed, he put out an Instagram where he had not one of our bands, but he had a band that he was breaking, and he literally was just pulling the band apart and breaking it. And that band is a much cheaper band that he had, and he just had it sit in his garage for a while, and it just dried out on him, right? So that does matter, though. Even if it didn't break, the way that band reacts to your movement is really important. So our bands are layered, and we will have the band guy coming on and talking about that in this podcast series, so you can learn a little bit more about why that matters. But the point is, in that 12-week process, everything we're doing with those bands is to be able to give you the tools you need to serve better posture so you can hold that posture longer. And I do believe that is a 3-month process. Now, from there, you can simply create more tension, get a thicker band or double up bands, or you can simply add load to your movements there and repeat the whole process again, right? So our run form program is yours forever. And some people, certainly for the convenience sake, and sometimes just within their goals, I wanted to bring up how strong do we need to be? And that's a conception that matters for vertical oscillation. So in other words, we can get to the point where we don't need to get stronger for endurance, okay? But the postural muscles that we're focused on in this program, they need that attention. And people blame it on sitting and lifestyle, and it's a combination of a lot of things, guys. But make no mistake about it, as good as our running is for us, we have to stack our joints and we have to hold that posture, and that needs continuous quality attention. Robust movements like the ones we have in run form will allow you to keep doing what you're doing really well. And especially the longer you're going, I think the more relevant these movements are for you. So on the flip side, I just want to cover this briefly, is sometimes I'll get a comment from somebody, where are the weights, or when am I going to get to the weights, right? Well, we do have our programs that we're putting out. We have a base program that we are putting out, but I do want people to go through run form first, even if you think that you are strong enough. So I'm going to give a quick example, and then I'll throw this back to you, Bobby, because I always love to hear your side of this. But with a particular athlete that was quite strong for her size relatively, the first thing that she wanted to make sure is that we're going to still lift heavy. Okay. I said, okay, well, I can't answer that yet. I need to take you through this process, look at the evaluation, and go from there. So what we found, for example, though, on her single leg squat, which was done in a Bulgarian position, we found that in a Bulgarian, her back leg would be up on the bench and then her front leg is forward. Well, first of all, she wasn't measured out properly for that Bulgarian in the first place. Okay, so we got her measured out. I taught her how to get into a proper Bulgarian. And then we had her using some weight and going up and down and getting to the point where she actually realized, yeah, like 30% probably of that weight was actually in the back leg. All right, so we understood that we have to get 95% of that weight in the front leg, okay? And we just had this discussion yesterday, again, with my mystery guest. We'll talk about this in detail when she comes on, but we got to the point where now, just in a few short weeks, we're actually lifting heavier. We're lifting heavier, more importantly, on that single leg. Okay, her grip has gone up, her grip strength. She has now the ability, though, in other words, to stack the joints properly and to get that system from toes to nose working together in that compound movement. Now we are establishing really strong position to reduce oscillation. Okay, so now that strength benefit really can come in. Okay, but this was a very experienced athlete, okay, who was able to, like I already mentioned, go twice a day because it's her job really, and on these drills that we worked on to connect the dots, if you will. So now the loading can work so much more effectively, okay? But I still think that comes down to, that's not the boulders. The boulders are the pillars that we have in run form. Those are the boulders we move. And now when we're trying to get to that next 3% or so, now we can really start to think about, can we now start to push this weight a little bit more, especially with an Ironman triathlete. I do believe they need to have a little bit more of that absolute strength for the distance to hold the posture over 3 disciplines longer. So getting stronger to go longer matters even more when you're talking about 8 to 9 hours.
Yep. No, I agree there, Matt. And I don't want to, even within the confines of this particular podcast, go down that road of the whole concept of heavy. I think there's a lot that you can contribute, a lot that I can contribute. I have a runner at the moment, and it really comes down to that there's also, even with the very elite athletes, there's an association with a certain type of work that they've associated with success, and they're really afraid to let it go. And there's Helgo Schomer did some great work on how addictive, lifting is, how addictive running is, how addictive cycling is, how addictive swimming is, right? So part of the changeover and the education and then the physical transition is that they don't get to shed a fat suit, right? So there's a period of time for them that they literally have to go out on a limb and trust us, that this will lead to what you are looking for, which is a performance improvement, right? But in many cases, that requires backtracking a little bit to what? The fundamentals. Get back to the fundamentals, the movement fundamentals, so that you can now build a structure that can handle that heavier weight. But I would go so far as to say that with the vast majority of people that we work with, they might never need to get back to that. They'll find that they get so much benefit from this other stuff. They need never get back to that.
Yeah, and
so just in the
I'm gonna just say on that point, and then I'll let you wrap up this podcast, Bobby. Is that mobility and motor control is the hierarchy that I think really want to establish in people to understand, and so that's rooted in our free mobility that we give on our website. But then I tell people after about 10 days, we really should be switching over to run form or continuing with some of that, but incorporating run form now for the fact that we're going to now really start to solidify the mobility that you're getting and really get that motor control mastered, right? And so those are the big boulders I was referring to before. And with that athlete, with the single leg Bulgarian, my whole point that was now that we are more on that single leg, less weight is more, because truly on a single leg, instead of it being, say, 70-30. And so now that we're at 90-95, the point is it's not how much we're lifting, it's how we're lifting it. So 3 to 5 reps done that way with the established mobility and motor control is what yields the results that you're looking for. But what that heavy looks like is completely different than I think most people have a conception of. And yeah, I do believe that most people, they can keep repeating the banded dynamics and continue to yield big benefits from that several times going through the process and just getting better and better with that.
Absolutely. And I'll close with this too. A lot of people, most people actually, end up finding out that with the new mobility, with the skill set, with the neuromuscular adaptation, they've had the strength and power all along. They just couldn't access it. And that's exactly what you're referring to. So folks, when it comes to vertical oscillation, it is a tool for you to look at understanding your own vertical oscillation across the pace spectrums, right? So that those zones now make sense in terms of your paces as well as your intensities, right? And then the very important one for me is intra-run. What's happening intra-run? Where can you add conditioning so that your optimal vertical oscillation becomes sustainable for the duration of the event? Matt, thanks so much. It was always cool talking to you again about this subject. I was actually quite interested to see what you'd come up with, and you were just like, as usual, always on the money.
Thank you, Bobby. It's awesome. Thanks, guys, for listening. Refer your friends. We're growing, and we want to be able to help as many people as possible. Till next time. As always, thanks for listening to the Run Form podcast. And as a reminder, we offer a totally free movement improvement assessment on our Pendola Project website. Here, you can get your own personalized protocol that will help your running today. So give that a try. Also, Bobby and I are experts on any question app where you can ask us, any question. So reach out to us directly there. Finally, if you learned anything new today, don't forget to share it with your compadres and leave us a quick review. That really helps us a lot. All the links you need are in the show notes below. Till next time, have a great run. Well, that was awesome. Yeah.